A story of tragic accidents, spectacular recoveries and lives lost for political points, now on BBC Learning with Accidents in Space.
For more than 40 years, humans have been going into space, exposing themselves to extreme danger and the risk all pioneers face, the possibility of death.
Do the wrong thing and zap, you're going to get zapped.
Your blood would boil.
You blow up like a balloon.
Death would come very, very quickly.
Lots of things can go wrong.
And go wrong hugely. Even tiny mistakes can have cataclysmic results, and people are killed.
Then I saw completely burned out body. There was no skin. He didn't have even eyes.
It could have been a catastrophic breakup.
I guess I got cold all over.
The leap into space may be humanity's most ambitious project ever, and dozens have died to achieve it. This is how they died, and why. Humans didn't just one day blast into space. They had to work up to the edge of space first. Men rode balloons to the limit of the atmosphere and parachuted 14 miles back down, just to see if they'd survive the experience. Test pilots flew X-planes at altitudes and speeds never before reached, and some didn't survive. And making those early days even more dangerous was the Cold War. The conquest of space was a grim, politically inspired race between the Soviets and the Americans. Behind the Iron Curtain, men were rushed through extreme training to get ready for life in space. Americans built rocket after rocket. The test program had many setbacks, and many of the rockets didn't get far off the pad. In Russia, the men the space race killed were usually celebrated and buried with honor. Many of them in Red Square. Men like Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, became internationally famous. But the first cosmonaut to die isn't amongst them. His death was a secret, kept for 40 years. It happened in 1961, when Valentin Bondarenko was 24 and a rising star in the Russian space program. He just got married and had a young daughter. He and his wife shared the dream that he'd be the first man in space. Bondarenko had only a few days to go before finishing his training. He faced one final test, but it was the one the trainee cosmonauts feared the most. 15 days sealed inside an isolation chamber, pressurized with oxygen. Trial by chamber was designed to weed out the men who couldn't endure the long confinement of space travel. Few cosmonauts who went into the chamber came out unscathed. Bondarenko was doing well enough, though, until the 10th day, when something went horribly wrong. A fire started, and with an atmosphere of pure oxygen, the isolation chamber rapidly became a furnace. Bondarenko was taken out alive and secretly rushed to a nearby hospital, but there was little the doctors could do.
I took his blanket very carefully from him. Then I saw completely burned out body, which I never have seen in my life before and after that. There was no skin. He didn't have hair. He didn't have even eyes.
Within hours, the first casualty of the space race was not only dead, but officially never existed.
We knew that better to keep our mouth shut, not to open it to tell some kind of state secrets.
And Bondarenko's death stayed secret for 40 years, until 1986, when the Soviets finally admitted to the tragedy, and space historian Asif Siddiqui was able to piece together the tragic chain of events.
He had some electrodes attached to his body, and he was removing the electrodes, which were designed to monitor his physiological reactions. He used a swab of cotton to wipe residue off his body, and one of those cotton things, he inadvertently threw it away, but it landed on a hot plate, which was designed for him to prepare food. Because it's a pure oxygen atmosphere, a spark almost occurred, and it just flared up into a big, huge fire.
Valentin Bondarenko was killed by a tiny mistake, the kind everyone makes. But in a pure oxygen atmosphere, it was fatal. The accident, understandably, made Russian space engineers almost phobic about the gas.
I don't think they ever really psychologically overcame this sort of fear of oxygen and disaster and fire for a long time.
If there had been international scientific openness instead of Cold War competition, this burnt-out space capsule might have taken 3 astronauts into orbit instead of to their graves. This is Apollo 1, where the Americans, independently, learnt their lesson about the dangers of pure oxygen. The story of that tragedy began on a cold January morning in 1967, when 3 astronauts walked out to face the cameras before beginning tests on their new space capsule. They were Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and one of the heroes of the American space program, Gus Grissom.
Do you ever think of the fact that you can get killed flying spacecraft?
Well, we recognize that we can get killed flying spacecraft, like we can get killed flying T-33s or T-38s or driving my Corvette. That's just one of the facts of life for everyone, but we have a job that is very fascinating and we're very interested in, and it's worth the risk.
Gus Grissom was first in line, it was said, for the moon. Instead, his wife Betty only has memories of a disaster.
Well, he'd been told he was going to be the first one on the moon. And, of course, he was pleased with that because that's what they all wanted to hear. Of course, that didn't make that one.
It was just after noon on that terrible day when Grissom led Chaffee and White to the launch tower, where the capsule was waiting.
I was a 12-year-old boy who was a big fan of spaceflight, and for some reason I decided that Gus Grissom was my favorite astronaut.
Once the men were inside, the capsule would be pressurized with pure oxygen, creating the same conditions as the Russian isolation chamber. This would be the last time anyone saw the 3 men alive. The day was already going badly. Communications between Mission Control and the capsule kept breaking down.
Say again, please.
At one point, Grissom made his famous remark about how are we going to talk to somebody on the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings here at the Cape.
Say again, please.
There was great confusion on the intercom loops. I was listening to the test conductor. I was listening to the voice loop from the astronauts inside the spacecraft.
Okay,
Shortly thereafter, then there was the call of something like fire in the spacecraft.
I thought I heard some high-pitched voices. I thought I heard somebody say, we're on fire. I thought I heard somebody say, get us out of here. I was fearful. I didn't know it was as much a Holocaust as it was.
The hatch was not designed to be opened quickly. It took 5 minutes. By then, all 3 astronauts were dead.
The Apollo 1 fire, for many people, especially for me when we heard about it, sort of brought the world to a stop. We knew riding on a rocket may have its moments, but never did we believe that that we would lose 3 of our colleagues on the ground before they even got into space.
The Apollo 1 fire was a tragedy that was, in the first case, preventable, and in the second case, should never even proceeded to the point where it needed to be prevented.
NASA was in shock and facing a barrage of criticism and wild speculation about what had happened. They launched an inquiry and soon made a horrifying discovery. Apollo 1, which everyone knew would have a pure oxygen atmosphere, had been packed with unprotected electrical cabling, surrounded by highly combustible materials.
We had the whole damn thing full of Velcro because the astronauts wanted to be able to stick things to the walls, to the console, to the everywhere, so it wouldn't be floating around. It traps all this oxygen in there, and you hit that thing with a flame, it almost literally exploded.
There's never been a full explanation of how the fire had been allowed to happen. But officially, the finger was pointed at managers who failed to manage and engineers who didn't think things through. But some disasters are more obviously the fault of the astronaut. Scott Carpenter, aboard Aurora 7 in 1962, became the second American in space. He was so entranced by the experience that he didn't want to come back.
Imagine the greatest relaxation you can think of. That's what it is. The view from that altitude is transcending. The combination of both of those is at least addictive.
Carpenter's orbiting rapture meant he came close to running out of fuel and being lost in space.
I wasn't happy with Scott Carpenter flying. I did everything that I thought was proper to ask for him not to fly when I found that he was going to fly.
Engine start.
I lost that request. He started out very well and ended up almost killing himself.
He's got a black heart.
Carpenter's mission was to carry out a series of experiments, but he was more interested in solving a beguiling mystery. On an earlier flight, astronaut John Glenn had reported seeing swarms of space fireflies.
He saw sparkling particles out the window, and he called them fireflies because we didn't have another name for them. There was even suspicion among some very bright people that there might be living creatures out there.
But the fireflies, if they existed, were elusive. Carpenter kept looking and kept going. Fuel began to run short.
My first inclination that we were not doing too well according to the flight plan was that he was using up too much fuel. And I tried to get the Capcoms around the world to say you're using too much fuel. So that really had me pissed off.
Finally, after 3 orbits, an increasingly anxious craft ordered Carpenter to come back down. To do this, he needed all the fuel he had left. But just as he was about to begin his descent, he saw something.
And here came all the fireflies past the window. And I realized at that time that they weren't living creatures. They were little flakes of ice.
He was busy beating on the side of the spacecraft, looking at all the fireflies.
I was having a marvelous time. I wasn't playing around.
Carpenter was lucky to get down alive. With too little fuel left for a controlled descent, Aurora 7 came careering through the atmosphere and splashed down hundreds of miles off target.
He was damn lucky. If he had gotten less velocity, he could have started in and burn up. He could have not got in at all. And then he would have been stuck there.
But Carpenter didn't mind. As the rescue fleet diverted to find him, he was still enjoying himself.
I got in the life raft, and I had a ball there in a gentle sea state, fair skies, and a chance to be alone in my contemplation of a recent fascinating experience.
Well, I think he had a great time up there.
It was the last mission Carpenter was ever asked to fly, but he probably didn't mind that either. He began a new career as a deep-sea diver. There are often tensions between those who man the rockets and the politicians and the generals who command them. The politicians often get their way, even when their orders are lethal. In 1960, a Russian rocket exploded on the launch pad, killing 126 engineers and ground crew. Against the better judgment of many of them, they were where they were and doing what they were doing because a Soviet general was impatient to see the rocket take off. Like other catastrophes, it was kept secret. But in 1967, there was a Russian space tragedy that the whole world watched. In April 1967, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was driven out to the Russian launch site at Baikonur, where a new rocket, the Soyuz 1, was waiting to take him into orbit. Soyuz had a troubled history. 3 unmanned launches had ended in disaster. That morning, Komarov had been told that the rocket had no fewer than 203 technical faults.
I was there when Komarov was being interviewed. And I saw that he was sort of depressed. He didn't smile, he didn't joke. He was sad and depressed.
The commanders were well aware of the rocket's accident-prone history. In fact, it was seen as so risky, they didn't allow Yuri Gagarin, the country's most famous cosmonaut, to be Komarov's backup pilot.
They offered Gagarin as a backup, but the political leadership of the country said they couldn't risk Gagarin's life. He was the last man who saw Komarov at the launch pad.
Komarov was launched on Soyuz 1 early on the morning of the 23rd of April. The date is significant. The Soviet government wanted to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution by having a man in space on May the 1st. Komarov's technical troubles started the moment he entered orbit. First, it was a solar panel. It wouldn't open. That meant not enough power and not enough control over the spacecraft. Komarov tried everything to make it work, even banging with his fist on the inside of the capsule. Finally, after 19 orbits, his commanders gave up. Komarov was ordered back to Earth.
Комаров очень спокойным голосом.
Komarov, in a very calm, normal voice, reported from orbit, "Well, now my antennas will burn out," which was supposed to happen, and he said, "See you on the Earth."
Komarov nursed the failing Soyuz into position for re-entry. So far, so good. He successfully sliced through the barrier of the Earth's atmosphere. The people on the ground breathed a sigh of relief and got ready to greet the returning hero. Prior to the launch, Soyuz had 203 technical faults. It was the 204th that was to prove lethal.
When the parachute went out, the ropes began twisting into a knot.
Они начали скручиваться.
With his tangled parachute flapping uselessly above him, Komarov realized he was about to die.
It hit the ground. The lander cracked, and there was a fire inside. Only part of his body and his head remained intact. The rest was burnt.
Next to the shattered capsule lay the twisted parachute that had failed Vladimir Komarov. It was discovered later that a mistake had been made at the factory. No matter how well the rest of the flight had gone, Komarov would never have got back alive. His fate was sealed months before the launch. So instead of having a man in space for May Day, the government that had sent Komarov up in an unreliable spacecraft were faced with a state funeral. Parts of the dead cosmonaut were buried in Red Square. The rest of his body lies at the crash site. While the Russians mourned their dead, the American space program forged ahead.
Eagle Houston, you're go for landing, over. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. 30 seconds forward. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, 20.
On the 20th of July 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was an extraordinary achievement, and since Apollo 1, the Americans had not lost a single life. Space travel looked almost easy. But as NASA were to discover on the very next moon flight, putting people into space will always be hazardous. On the 14th of November 1969, NASA was preparing to launch Apollo 12, its second mission to the moon. That morning, a rain front had settled over Cape Kennedy, and the clouds were low.
I can remember sitting in that console with my hands sweating just prior to liftoff. Nobody knew it, but I was nervous.
But rain or no rain, President Nixon was in the crowd, and neither Griffin nor anyone else wanted to disappoint him. Anyway, why should rain make any difference?
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff. 11:22 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
We knew what the weather was, but we weren't concerned. For some reason, we didn't think it was a problem to launch into clouds. Dick and I just kind of said, well, it's okay with us, no problem, because we fly airplanes in the rain all the time. Everything's going great, you know, and it's a new experience for me. This is my first space flight, so I'm very, very excited, probably compared to Dick and Pete.
Pete Conrad reports that your program is in.
The first 38 seconds of the launch was completely normal.
Altitude at 1.5 miles.
And then along about 50 seconds or so, something happens.
All the telemetry data, the measurements coming from the spacecraft that I was watching all went to nonsensical values.
These warning lights come on and all sorts of caution and alarms.
The crew started talking about this Christmas tree that had lit up.
Yeah, I don't know what happened here. We had everything in the world drop out. I'm not sure we get hit by lightning.
And the crew started reading out this long sequence of main bus undervolts, AC undervolts.
Fuel cell lights and AC bus light, fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload 1 and 2, main bus A and B.
36 seconds after blastoff, Apollo 12 had been struck by lightning.
I thought we were going to have to abort. If you got a strike, it could have been a catastrophic breakup, a flip, and maybe breaking the whole vehicle apart. And with that much propellant, hydrogen, oxygen, it would have been a huge fireball.
Apollo 12 was in mortal danger. Somehow the lightning strike had cut off the flow of data to the ground, and Mission Control was as good as blinded.
The first thing I wanted to do was to see if I could restore my data stream.
Aaron realized that somewhere in the command module was a backup system that could save them, but its use had hardly been a major part of astronaut training.
So I said SCE to aux flight, I think that was basically the exact words. Nobody knew really where it was. And Capcom was frantically looking through his pages and he said, oh, I think that's on A10 or something. It was some panel. The crew came back and said, what?
I don't think I'd ever thrown that switch in my life.
One little switch saved the mission. Mission Control got its data, its sight, back. Apollo 12 had survived the lightning strike, and Bean and his fellow astronauts went to the moon and walked on it.
Hey, there it is. There it is. Son of a gun, right down the middle of the road. Hang in there. 30 seconds. Coming down at 2. He's got it made. Come on in there.
Going to the moon not only looked easy now, it looked fun. But then came the next mission. Apollo 13. It was the third moon journey, and the astronauts were Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert.
Ignition flight. Roger.
As their Saturn V rockets soared upwards, neither they nor Mission Control knew that a few mundane factory errors had turned the ship into a time bomb. Everything was fine until 55 hours and 62,000 miles into the flight. The astronauts were a quarter of the way to the moon. It was, incidentally, April the 13th, 1970. On the ground, everything about the flight was being watched by somebody. Cy Liebergott was watching the oxygen tanks in the service module, which supplied power and air to the spacecraft.
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over. Okay, we read you, Jack.
Liebergott decided that the oxygen in the tanks needed to be stirred, agitated, and he asked the crew to turn on the fans that would do that.
I decided that I wanted to have an extra stir
before they went to sleep.
And that's when the factory error struck. Inside the tank were damaged wires. An accident was waiting to happen.
And if I hadn't done that, of course, you wouldn't be talking to me right now.
Kane, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tank.
Okay.
When the crew switched on the fans, there was a spark and the tank exploded. The service module was wrecked.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
I knew from the metallic ringing or sound in the vehicle from the explosion and the metal actually crinkling in the tunnel. I knew something bad had happened.
That'll be the bus Undervolt. Roger, main B Undervolt. And we hit a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
Stand by 13, we're looking at it.
We were faced with a cascading failure. Cascading like a bunch of dominoes falling all at one time.
Okay, now let's everybody keep cool. We got limbs still attached. Let's make sure we don't blow the whole mission.
I guess I got cold all over.
The explosion had blown away the side of the service module, and vital gases poured uncontrollably into space. A routine mission had become a life or death struggle, and 3 men's lives now hung in the balance.
Okay, let's make sure that we don't do anything that's going to blow our electrical power with the batteries or that will cause us to lose the fuel cell number 2.
Calculating furiously, Mission Control discovered that the astronauts might have just enough power and air to get back home. But to save these precious resources, they would have to shut down their command module and move into the smaller lunar module. The module would now never land on the moon, but it might save their lives.
When I realized we had lost an oxygen tank, I was just sick to my stomach because we had lost the mission. We were not going to get to land.
Apollo 13 didn't have enough power to just turn around and come home. Mission Control needed the moon's gravity to slingshot the spacecraft back to Earth. So they had to go around the moon, a place they would now never set foot on. With power reduced to a minimum, conditions inside the lunar module were bleak and miserable.
I've described it as being out in the woods and you don't have adequate clothing on. You don't have a jacket and you sit out there for several days, in our case 4 days. You get pretty chilled, and that just wore me down, and as I found out later, a staph virus that was on board got me, and I ended up with a lower urinary tract infection as a result.
The interim here, we're starting to go ahead and button up the tunnel again.
In Mission Control, anxiety rose as Apollo 13 approached Earth.
Stand by 13, we're looking at it.
They started off very diplomatically saying, gosh, Houston, these are not the exact words, but basically the context, gosh, Houston, how's that entry sequence coming? And then, a few hours later, called it, how's the entry sequence coming? At one point, I remember they said, hey, Houston, we're looking out the window, and Earth's getting pretty big.
To start the return, the astronauts had to go back into the command module, defrost, and power it up. As Mission Control began dictating the necessary but very complicated list of instructions to the crew, an unexpected problem arose.
They started reading it up to the crew, and I think it took like 2 hours to read this to the crew. And in fact, the crew had trouble finding enough paper to write it down on. And that thought never occurred to me that we were building such a complicated sequence that was going to save this mission and save the crew, and the key resource might be enough paper to write it down on.
Now came re-entry itself, the most hazardous part of the trip. First, the crew had to jettison the crippled service module.
When they backed away from the service module, they could tell that the whole side of the service module had been blown off.
There's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. The whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine. Copy that.
Seeing the extensive damage caused by the explosion raised fresh fears. What else might fail when Apollo 13 attempted re-entry?
The big issue then was the heat shield, right? There was no way to understand what the heat shield had done. The only way to test the heat shield was to hit the atmosphere.
When we went into the blackout period on entry, it started right where it was supposed to start. And normally we could time those things, those blackout periods, within a matter of just a couple of seconds on start and a couple of seconds on when they would come out, and we could make radio contact. And you could have heard a pin drop in here. Only the Capcom kept calling. Yeah, Apollo 13, this is Houston. Nothing. I noticed in that period nobody was looking at each other. We were all kind of looking straight ahead because we all had in our mind that we've come this far and that damn heat shield must have been damaged and they've burned up.
It's been 2 minutes now from time of drogue deployment.
2 or 3 minutes after they should have come back into contact, Capcom kept calling Apollo 13, this is Houston. Finally, Jack Swigert, hello Houston, this is Apollo 13, everything's fine here. And everybody just, you know, oh God, it was such a relief.
An extremely loud applause here in Mission Control. This is Apollo 13 on main chutes, comes through loud and clear on the television display here.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the base. It really looks great.
When we saw him here on the big screen on television, this place went crazy. More so than any flight probably before or after.
The extraordinary moment in an entry when you really know you effectively have it made is when you can see the main chutes. From there on, it's just waiting for impact on the ocean.
Apollo 13, this is recovery, over.
If Apollo 13 had been a close scrape for the Americans, it was humiliating to the Russians. Not only had they lost the race to the moon, they'd watched the Americans turn disaster into triumph, all live on television. The Russians' compulsive secrecy had gained them nothing. Razzmatazz American style looked better, so that's what they tried. Now their missions would go out live to the Russian people, and their cosmonauts would become household names. But the Soviets were plagued again by disaster, and their first attempt at space ballet ended in tragedy. In 1971, 3 cosmonauts were sent to Salyut 1, an orbiting space station. They spent more than 3 weeks up in space. They became television personalities, national celebrities who performed their antics in zero gravity. But off-screen, things weren't happy. First-time mission commander Georgy Dobrovolsky continually clashed with his more experienced crew. They set an endurance record, 24 days. But staying in space has never been as hazardous as going back to Earth. When the time came to return, the crew were worried. and they had every reason to be. As explosive bolts separated the three modules of the Soyuz spacecraft, a valve shattered. There was a leak. Precious air began to be sucked from the capsule into the vacuum of space. Dobrovolsky and his crew struggled to find the leak, but they couldn't.
It's like a kid's balloon. Inflate it and then you stick it with a needle. Immediately all the air goes out of this balloon. But it is so small that if you knew where it is, you could simply cover it with the palm of your hand.
From the ground, everything looked normal. The capsule had made its re-entry and was lazily parachuting to Earth. Lazily and silently.
No report was coming from a spaceship. Of course we were worried, but the rescue team report wasn't encouraging. They reported on the radio that they say that we see the lander. It all works well on the main parachute. It goes down and the rescue helicopters going to the landing site. And just in 2 minutes after the lander was on the ground, the rescue teams were running to the lander. In another 2 minutes, they opened the cover and they saw the cosmonauts sitting in the seats, but with bluish spots on their faces and blood spilled from noses and ears.
The Soviet Union had chosen the worst possible time to go public. The Russian people had taken the three cosmonauts to their hearts. Now these men lay dead on the steppes of Kazakhstan. The cost in human lives of conquering space was rising. So far, 135 men had died, most of them Russian. But the Americans were also to experience grief on a national scale. Cape Canaveral, 1986. It was a freezing cold January day, and the Space Shuttle Challenger waited on the launch pad. A crew of 7 was on board, among them a civilian. Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher who had won her place in a national competition organized by NASA to boost interest in the shuttle.
When I'm up in that shuttle, and I'm not going to be teaching at Concord High School, I want everybody working real hard to make education what it should be in this country. Thank you very much.
The launch had already been delayed several times, and now the freezing weather was causing concern. McAuliffe and the rest of the crew didn't realize it, but behind the scenes there had been acrimonious arguments about whether the shuttle's booster rockets were safe to use in low temperatures. The morning of the launch was worryingly cold, but NASA decided to risk it. All over the US, people tuned in to see the New England schoolteacher and her colleagues go into orbit. In the crowd at Cape Canaveral were McAuliffe's family and friends, as well as her backup, Barbara Morgan, who would have been on Challenger if McAuliffe had somehow been unable to fly. First, everything seemed fine.
Roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. We'll throttle down to 65%.
A minute passed, and then Mission Control issued a routine but fateful instruction.
Challenger, go and throttle up. Roger, go and throttle up.
Flight GC, we've had negative contact, lost downlink. Okay, all operators, watch your data carefully.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Flight Fido. Go ahead. RSO reports vehicle exploded.
Copy.
The crew compartment took 2 minutes to drop into the ocean. All 7 crew were killed. Engineers had warned NASA not to launch in freezing weather. They said that rubber seals in the booster engines, called O-rings, might fracture in the cold. And fracture they did. Video footage of the launch shows a plume of black smoke as the rubber rings, meant to seal the joints between the booster sections, begin leaking. Leaking fuel. At the command throttle up, the fuel ignites, and the main rocket explodes. Over a decade later, and shuttles now upgraded make routine flights into space. But space experts know that it's just a matter of time.
It's inevitable that there will be a major accident. Even NASA sort of projects a catastrophic failure, 1 in 68 launches, and we have to be prepared to accept it or prepared to deal with that when it happens. The one thing we can't do is pretend that it's not going to happen.
The next stage in the conquest of space is taking place 200 miles above our heads. The most expensive object ever built, the International Space Station. The dream for the future is that one day space stations will house populations of hundreds, people living and working in a place where until very recently, no living creature had ever been. It's a massive technological achievement, but only made possible by the pioneers who died to conquer the cold, dark vacuum above our heads.